Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you doing?
I'm okay. Yourself, Nick?
I'm doing okay as one can do on a Tuesday. And also joining us today is Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, I believe you had a hectic weekend. Thank you for being with us here.
Yeah, no problem.
Despite that,
How's it?
very good to have you with us. Okay, let us talk about what is going on in our fair nation. And the first story for today is I was prompted by this long form piece that was actually done in a foreign publication, The New Yorker, a magazine, which published a long article online titled The Dystopian Underworld of South Africa's Illegal Gold Mines. And this was an in-depth examination of South Africa's illegal mining industry, particularly around the town of Welkom in the Free State. The article goes through the sort of history of gold mining in South Africa and how important it was, and specifically the town of Welkom. And then it charts the fascinating rise to power of a very particular guy who, and I won't get too specific on all this because actually I believe some of this is still being fought out in the courts. But basically, the story alleges that this guy rose to influence in Welkom by first making an alliance with the so-called Russian gangs. They call themselves Russians, Maresha, but they're actually mostly Basotho people who provided armed security for this guy's enterprise. And then what he did was he sold food to underground illegal miners for enormous markups. So often how these illegal mines work is there's an enormous number of disused gold mines around South Africa, which don't have clear ownership, or the holes weren't all fully closed or something like that. And these illegal miners go down into these old disused shafts and they look for like the support beams of the mine shafts, which still have some gold in them, and they mine those sometimes, or they just continue the mine as it was from the point at which it stopped mining. And as you can imagine, this is extremely dangerous. Some of these mines have been disused for decades, and so there's poisonous gases in there that can also explode sometimes. There's not proper ventilation. And the numerous gangs often fight battles underground and make shrapnel bombs and things. The story goes into detail to some degree about some of the security guards hired by, in this case, the Harmony Gold Company, who were underground trying to patrol it for illegal miners, and said that despite some of them being veterans of the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, that the underground mines around Welkom were actually more dangerous in their opinion, which is quite something to think about. Anyway, so the story in the New Yorker charts the rise of this guy who gets extremely wealthy from selling food to these miners underground. He then becomes kind of essentially a mafia overlord of the town. Allegedly, he even paid Welkom's municipal bill when it failed to pay its electricity bill to Eskom at one point. And he's also alleged by the story to have contributed lots of money to like school uniforms and soccer uniforms and fixed roads, and essentially set himself up as a kind of shadow government, untouched because he had a lot of the police force on his payroll. So it's a very interesting story, I think. Terence, let me start with you. I think it says quite a lot about what's happened to large parts of rural South Africa, but also perhaps some explanation for how things kind of keep going, which is that these informal and the illicit economies are actually still very powerful in South Africa. And there's a lot of vested interests in making things work, at least to a certain degree. What's your take on this story, and maybe how we can avoid the kind of mafiaization of large parts of the country that we seem to be seeing at the moment?
Well, look, first of all, just a disclaimer that I've had a bit of flu over the last couple of days. So Russians to Russians, that's very interesting. The first conference I ever spoke at back in 1997, I remember I was talking about rural local government, and I quoted from a paper that someone had written, which I found quite insightful, saying that in the absence of an effective state, people will gravitate to whoever can provide the social goods and services, so water supply, whatever. And I think that turned out to be prophetic more than anything else. And this is a wonderful example of that. Where governments have failed or become so comprehensively discredited that people just don't bother anymore, there's an opportunity for criminal elements, warlords or crime bosses or whatever, to provide just enough to give them a certain degree of legitimacy, which the state has forfeited, to, as you say, keep things ticking over. And this is, of course, not a uniquely South African phenomenon. With the narcotics trade in Latin America, you've got whole regions of countries, and even large parts of those countries themselves, that are effectively controlled by gang bosses. Who was the big Colombian guy? I think they made
Pablo Escobar.
Right. I mean, I heard at one stage that he got told of the Colombian government and said, just lay off and I'll pay off your national debt. So he's got 13, 18 wheelers full of American dollars. They can go be debt free tomorrow. That's what happens when you reach a certain particular level of criminal penetration, or alternatively, if you seed that by your own incompetence and dysfunction. Well, what is Mr. and Mrs. John Q. Average supposed to do? Someone who's offering them something is better than someone who's offering them nothing at all. But yeah, a very very tragic story that this that this becomes a reality that people become locked into.
Marius, what do you make of this story? I think it's kind of like a microcosm of so many of the issues that have bedeviled rural South Africa. You've got kind of economic depression, and then you've got people seeking out new opportunities, often from maybe not entirely legal avenues. And it all kind of bundles together with the degradation of the state, as we've talked about. This really seems like a problem that's going to be with us for a long time, even if we start to improve some of the conditions that drive people to get into, illegal mining or something. Are there any short-term fixes for this, or do you think this is a long-term project?
Yeah, it's a long-term project. Like a lot of things that the done in South Africa, it's even if tomorrow we got, say, I don't know, a bunch of bureaucrats from Switzerland who are going to run South Africa now, it will still take them 10 years probably to fix some of the really serious problems that we have here. I mean, a lot of these things that just it all links back to breakdowns in the States. I mean, we have illegal immigrants from Lesotho that are here. They're obviously not here legally. They've obviously got, they haven't followed the proper rules to be resident in South Africa. And it's all then also linked to, let's say, economic degradation. And I'm sure a lot of the Zamazamas would probably much rather be working as miners, for a formal mining company or some other kind of job, because the Zama work isn't great either, I don't think. I mean, people are underground for literally months at a time sometimes. I mean, as you're saying, they have these running battles. So I think most people probably wouldn't be all that keen on doing that kind of work. And they also, I mean, you see them, they often operate quite openly in parts of Benoni, depending where you are. You can hear the blasting in the evenings. Also, I was in Pilgrim's Rest in 2021 and went for a walk, and you could see the Zamazamas actually, they were bathing in the streams and, drying their clothes and pretty openly. Yeah, but to be fair, when I was talking to the people at, the locals in Pilgrim's Rest, they said the Zamazamas actually don't cause too much trouble. They just, and they're actually bringing money into the local community by, shopping and so on. So, and as I say, they weren't really causing any crime. So there wasn't actually that much opposition to the Zamazamas there. So, yeah, but as I said, it all comes back to the breakdown in the South African state. And also, I mean, the state definitely doesn't have a monopoly on violence in South Africa anymore. And that's kind of one of your core definitions of what makes up a state or a stable government, is that they have a monopoly on violence within their territory. And, the South African state definitely doesn't have that.
Yeah, it's it's becoming increasingly apparent that this is the case. In the end, this syndicate was somewhat broken down in Welkom. There's still Zamazamas there, but the problem was made less severe by a combination of Harmony Gold Mine sending in, I think, a lot of private security, but at the same time, I think the national government bringing in 500 cops from Bloemfontein, so a couple hundred kilometers away, to eventually arrest a huge number of these guys, fill up the mine shafts, that kind of stuff. And yet, despite all that, there's still, these gangs operating under the town. And I think one of the very interesting things to take away from this story is that, one of the stories of South Africa since at least the sort of early 2000s is the decline of the mining industry, mostly due to all of the things that we regularly talk about as causing economic problems. BEE, over aggressive regulation, high taxes, poisonous labor disputes, etc., etc. And yet, despite the sort of clamp on the formal mining industry, South Africa is so mineral resource rich that you still can't stop the mining. It just goes on and on. And I think that really speaks to how much potential there is if we remove those stoppages. How many of these guys we could get hopefully back into formal mines rather than running around with gangs underground, risking their lives and getting blown up and shooting each other and all that kind of thing. Because, as you said, Marius, I suspect if a lot of these guys who are often experienced miners could get proper jobs in the formal industry, they probably would go back.
If I could just jump in there, I used to do quite a lot of writing about the mining industry, and I remember speaking to a guy who had been involved since I think the 60s, and he said that South Africa was what they called in the industry the dripping roasts, these big gold seams and precious metal deposits where you had to invest a lot of money, and you could then send people down and you could pull out enormous chunks of ore. And he says that those are depleted. We still have, I think it's like $1 trillion worth or something of resources. But he says you need a very different kind of industry. And he says, for instance, in Australia, you have these little mobile units, like 4 or 5 guys. Now they are usually quite skilled technicians. And they'll literally bring their little station with them, set it up with their generator and everything, and they'll spend a couple of months, taking out what is a very small deposit, but a valuable and economical at that level. And he says that's essentially what you need to bring mining into the into the future here. And unfortunately, if it's sort of left to gun-toting criminal networks, that sort of thing becomes very, very unattractive.
Now, just as a final thought on this, one of the key features of this story, as with so many stories, unfortunately, in South Africa today, was the prevalence of hitmen. Hitmen being used to assassinate rival members of the of the gold smuggling operations, that kind of thing. And yet, in a recent media briefing given by the National Police Commissioner, Masemola, he denied that the police had. He said that the police were not aware of any syndicates involving hitmen, and said that this wasn't necessarily the case. That hitmen were not necessarily the reason for the spike in murders that we've seen in the last year. Any final thoughts on this one, Marius?
I mean, pretty well-known South African celebrity got murdered in hits like less than a week ago. And we're getting told that it's not this isn't a big deal, or it's not common. So I mean, we must be one of the only countries in the world where that's pretty common. Where that I can move off the top of my head, where somebody who's, I don't know, no AKA's music particularly well or anything, but apparently he's the biggest hip hop guy in South Africa, and he gets shot dead in cold blood, almost in broad daylight. And we say, oh no, there's no problem with hitmen in South Africa.
It's just utter madness.
I also remember, I'm reminiscing a bit. This also going back to my early career. I remember doing some work on the taxi industry. And there was an article which I think was published in the City Press that I remember very distinctly, talking about violence and how this is it had evolved from operators shooting at each other, ad hoc, to proper warfare. And there was this diagram of how this one particular battle had unfolded. Reinforcements coming down this route, and apparently at that stage you could get someone to do a hit for 500 rand. I think the going rate now is 2,600, which, accounting for inflation, is actually lower than it was. And there's also people, apparently they'll sit around like say, well, no, get him, he's good. He'll make your problem go away. So no, and this I think also gets into the frayed social fabric. Countries that are poorer, that are more desperate than we are, just don't do this. I know someone who got hijacked in Mozambique, and these guys actually had a sense of humor. Made it quite clear he's a tourist. They didn't want to rough him up too badly. They just wanted to check what he had. They'll take their share and please go and have a nice holiday and come back next year so we can rob you again.
You see, it's sustainable burglary. I like it. Anyway, let's move off this onto a different topic. There's been a little of a brouhaha in the courts in a battle between an American NGO called the Lifeline Foundation and the South African Home Affairs Department. So the Lifeline Foundation, as far as I understand, is a group which evacuates Afghans from Afghanistan. Of course, as everyone I'm sure knows, the Taliban retook Afghanistan after 20 years in exile, overthrowing the elected government there. And since then, the country has become a dystopian nightmare. Women's rights have been effectively abolished in the country. There's a famine developing right now. The economy has almost entirely collapsed. And there are many people who have cooperated with the previous government or with the Americans or their allies during the military campaign there, who are desperately seeking asylum in other countries across the world to escape the Taliban. Well, apparently Lifeline Foundation attempted to get a group of 22 Afghan nationals into the country. They had issued letters to Home Affairs saying that they intended to bring these 22 people in. Home Affairs says, however, attempted to block them at the gate, saying that this was an abuse of the asylum system, that they hadn't been given proper notification. They said that the lawyers for this foundation didn't name their clients and didn't mention where they came from, that the Afghan nationals arrived suddenly and informed the officials they wanted to enter South Africa as their lawyers had given prior notice. They were allegedly in possession of visas for Zimbabwe, but not South Africa. However, I think the rules tend to be a little bit different for asylum seekers, considering the fact that, they're on the run. Anyway, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation said, the South African government notes the overtures made to the country to consider receiving a number of Afghan refugees who have previously sought refuge in Pakistan. The South African government is unfortunately not in a position to accommodate such a request. And Home Affairs Minister Aaron Motsoaledi said that giving the Afghan nationals asylum could pose a safety risk. He said, quote, if there are people that are in danger in Afghanistan and they rush to South Africa, the Taliban decides to follow them here. Isn't the US the most powerful country to defend and protect them? As they are the ones who went to Afghanistan to take over from the Taliban, not us, because you see, we don't have any military power, he told some reporters.
Maybe a true word, eh?
Yeah, let me start with you. What do you make of the story?
Me.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, look, I think this has like tragedy and farce rolled up in it. On the one hand, in a way, I can sort of understand the position that Home Affairs is taking. They reckon they've been blindsided or whatever. On the other, aren't we, a caring, give a damn society that wants to throw hands across the world for all the oppressed? Provided the oppressed we like. But I think on a more serious note, there's something of a lacuna in our refugee/asylum system. We get we've had a fairly large influx of people coming particularly from elsewhere in Africa, who from Zimbabwe, from Congo, wherever, These are people who, a combination of political repression, war instability, and just desperation. And the approach to this is kind of to ignore it or to do ad hoc deportations. It's kind of like, well, the foreigners are taking our jobs now, women, but we must be nice to them at the same time. It's incoherent messaging. And then you patrol Hillbrow and demand people tell you what elbow is in Zulu or you deport them. Very, very, very disjointed and ad hoc, and often playing some of the more xenophobic of our sentiments. When it comes to those like individuated cases, somebody with a personal sense of threat, South Africa doesn't really seem to know how to deal with that. We have had a couple of those from Zimbabwe, and it's never quite clear how they're resolved. It sort of seems to boil down to, well, someone has a tourist visa and they can stay here for a while until they can get somewhere else. I'm not actually aware of us really having any high profile refugees. I know that a similar situation arose with some people from Syria. And I think that sort of the report I read, this was grinding on because they didn't have any relatives in South Africa, and South Africa's got good relations with Syria. So how can this actually be a problem? Should them just go back to Syria? But once again, this no less than the situation with the Zama-Zamas. This is about the descent into insanity of the South African state.
Yeah, I find all of this just kind of a bit laughable. I mean, I know that there are people who have been placed on US terror lists in South Africa who are for suspected being connected to groups like ISIS. And the South African system, I believe they were put on trial, but then the investigation was bungled. And so, I mean, is the minister correct that we can't protect people from terror groups? Probably, but I just kind of a bit of a joke because there's no concern about that. And now it looks like this is going to end up in court because I believe there was a court order that was originally issued to let the asylum seekers in. And the government is going to spend some ungodly amounts of money trying to keep 22 people who probably deserve asylum a lot more than a lot of other people out of the country. Marius, what do you make of the story?
Well, I mean, Era Motsoaledi is definitely right that we can't protect people who are on the run from oppressive governments. The Rwandan government, as a matter of course, kills Rwandan exiles in not only South Africa but around the world. So he's definitely right there. But I don't think that the Taliban government will be, looking for these 22 people. I mean, I'd be very surprised with the high-ranking Taliban officials. They're probably just people who are trying to get out of Afghanistan.
Probably interpreters or some such thing.
Exactly, or maybe not even, or just people who, where it's just a place you don't want to live anymore. So yeah, I mean it's pretty laughable. But just as an aside, there was a tweet going around a little while ago on Twitter, obviously, and it was an email apparently from a former Taliban soldier who'd now been seconded to Kabul to work as just a technocrat in some government office, and he was complaining because it was very boring. He had to be at work from 8 to 4 o'clock. It wasn't like fun when they were fighting the war, and it was like all exciting. And Kabul is a very dangerous place, and you always have to carry a weapon with you. And he had to bring his family from whatever small place he was from to Kabul, and it was horrible. So I just thought that was pretty funny. And but I think we'll probably also find there might be some of those Afghanistani refugees when they get you. They might actually think that Kabul is a bit safer than Joburg or some other place in South Africa. So I'd be interested to see what their perceptions are of the country.
It's just
they got their civil servants to work from 8 to 4. Maybe we should get Taliban consultants here.
I think this is just another sort of mark against our country's abysmal foreign policy, which just continues to find whatever the wrong side of any argument is, whether there's supporting Venezuela or backing some nonsense going on in China, something like that. Our government just seems to be always on the side of the cruel and the oppressive.
I mean,
but anyway.
Yeah, but that said, lots of governments around the world, including the West and so on, they support oppressors. I mean, look at the US supporting Saudi Arabia, for example.
Yeah,
But
but
we are always supporting
they don't have a
oppressors
quote
who have
unquote.
terrible economies.
Right.
So,
They,
I mean,
yeah, well, that's a start. It's not even strategic.
we're on the
We
side of the Russians here, and whatever you think of the whole conflict, just economically doesn't make sense for us to be more on the Russian side than the West, compared to how much trade we have with the West and so on compared to Russia.
Right, and they also don't have a explicitly quote unquote human rights focused foreign policy, which has supposedly been the ANC's foreign policy for 30 years. Anyway, okay, let's move on to the next story. This one, it's not like a big deal, but it was just kind of interesting, I think, because it's a phenomenon that is sort of under discussed in our politics a bit, and that is the role of South Africa's many churches in our political landscape. So, any student of apartheid will know that that a big piece of the anti-apartheid movement was, in fact, the numerous churches around the country, not just the sort of more traditional European churches like the Anglican Church and such, but also the African independent churches, things like the ZCC, the sort of the South African branches of like the Methodist Church, and for example, were very key, I think, to the ANC managing to gain the presence that it has across the country's political landscape. And we've seen a little nod to this, and I think up till now, most of South Africa's churches have either been apolitical since '94 or been pro-ANC. I think that's generally been the trend. But we're seeing some interesting things going on. So recently, the DA leadership in KZN went on a little visit to the Shembe Church in Pietermaritzburg. The Shembe Church claims to have, I think, 4 million members across South Africa, so it's one of the biggest churches in the country. And the DA said that they were visiting the church to, quote, thank the Inkosi for the role he and the church are playing in social cohesion, peace, and the eradication of many of the social ills within our society. The DA views the Shembe Church and the Inkosi as a moral compass in our society. They also apparently donated 2 cattle to the Shembe Church leader. Their provincial leader was there, Francois Rogers, who said that a DA government was committed to serving all South Africans regardless of religion, race, and culture. And apparently the Inkosi did bless the delegation there. Marius, what do you make of the politics of this? It's quite interesting. Not the first time we've seen this for sure, but do you think churches might have a bigger role to play in the new political landscape that's emerging?
Yeah, I think so, especially if they can get these big churches can endorse opposition parties and so on. And that all said, I mean, I don't know how much it'll shift the needle if the Shembe or ZCC churches came out tomorrow and said, don't vote for the ANC, rather vote for EFF or the DA or the Action SA. I mean, might influence some church members, but I mean, also must assume all these church members have a hive mind, and just because the church leader says something, they all of a sudden you can decide to, go a certain way. But yeah, I just think it's interesting, politics that's happening. And I mean, as you said, they're big, they have large memberships. When we were discussing the show earlier, they reckon 40 in the mid 90s, they reckon about 40% of Black South Africans were members of these kind of African independent churches, and I would be surprised if that's declined significantly. So it's probably still around about 40 or 50%. So, and yeah, I think also shows that the DAs don't look at different ways of doing politics in South Africa, and maybe there will be a couple of people who, see the DA coming to attend a church meeting like this as, they're not being a white party or whatever anymore, and might change their mind maybe on voting for the DA or voting for a different party than the ANC.
Terence, you were pointing out in our pre-show discussion that there's actually a very long history of sort of seeking out the blessing of churches in South African politics.
Yeah, look, South Africans across cultural lines tend to be quite religious and quite, in that sense, small c conservative. Now, these African independent churches adopted a semi-apolitical stance, which is ironic because they actually generally were established as alternatives to the missionary or the European-controlled churches, previous to that. But in the 1980s, they tended to be more focused on spiritual and immediate community matters. P.W. Botha actually made the trek to Maria to the to address the ZCC, which was quite a coup for him at the time. And we've seen over the years there've been regular treks of political leaders to these. Jacob Zuma was very big into doing this sort of thing. We've seen the old DP, the DAB, having gone there before. But I think what Marius is onto, and I think this is important, is not so much getting their endorsement, but getting their sort of acceptance that you are legitimate, that you are part of
like a player in an option to consider at least.
Yeah, and you are part of the society in which our members find themselves. Look, there has been a lot of talk about this, and this goes right back to 1994, that these churches might be able to provide some sort of nucleus of a non-ANC voting bloc. People who are explicitly socially conservative, motivated by messages about personal upliftment, personal responsibility, generally, let's say, capitalist in orientation. I remember, I think it was the head of the ZCC gave a testimony to the Truth Commission, sort of shocked everyone by walking with this entourage, I think of 30 women, sitting down and saying, "Well, we were neutral. That's our theology. We don't apologize for it, and please stop abortion." But what? Once again, you are dealing with a particular spiritual and cultural mindset, which I don't think many of the mainstream churches in this country fully understand. Very syncretic, traditional beliefs alongside Christianity. A lot of beliefs in the power, in sort of prophetic power of individuals. Also mixed in with ancestor veneration. Often very difficult to sort of for outsiders to understand. And I think for that, I think it's good that the DA whose, let's say, cultural origins lie elsewhere are making the effort to reach out.
That's something interesting to watch, and I wonder whether there will be more involvement from some of these various independent churches across the country as we get into more competitive politics going forward. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. I hope that you found the show interesting, and we will be back tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.